to this March 1st meeting of the Charlotte City Council Budget and Governance Committee. We'll start as usual with introductions. My name is Ed Driggs. I chair the committee. Council members online, would you introduce yourselves?
Good afternoon, Dimple Ajmera, Vice Chair and the committee member.
Greg Phipps, committee member.
Great. And why don't we go around the room?
Good afternoon, Liz Babson with the Charlotte Department of Transportation.
Good afternoon, Charlie Jones with the Charlotte Department of Transportation.
That's Teresa Smith, CFO.
Brent Cagle, Assistant City Manager.
Matt Hassett, City Finance.
Patrick Baker, City Attorney.
Donata Jackson, Office of Constituent Services.
Ryan Bergman, Budget Director.
Marie Harris, Strategy and Budget.
And is there anybody else online? All right, so let's get started. Our first agenda item is transportation capital investments, and I'd like to hand over to Liz Babson to talk about that.
Thank you, Councilmember Driggs. Again, my name is Liz Babson, and I'm the Director for the Charlotte Department of Transportation. Next slide, please. Happy to be with you this afternoon, Budget and Evaluation Committee. So at your February committee meeting, you had some discussion and questions about our current transportation programs in the CIP. So we've come back today to provide you some follow-up information. I'll start with a quick summary of some important policy work that we've done over the last 2 decades to improve our transportation system for all of our users, and then we'll walk through project prioritization for our capital programs, focusing on sidewalk and pedestrian safety, street lighting that we achieve through our Vision Zero program, and then we'll review our resurfacing program. So with me today, I have Charlie Jones, who's our Deputy Street Superintendent, and he'll talk to you a little bit about that resurfacing program at the end. We also provided in your packet a number of maps, a few of which we'll review today. And these maps represent the backlog for various types of transportation investments across the city that are achieved through our CIP. Next slide, please. And so again, as a reminder, at your last committee meeting, Ryan showed you the draft 5-year bond plan for the FY 2022 budget. And as you requested, we've come back today to share in more detail 3 of those programs and the projects that we're pursuing. And so I'll cover the first 2 and then turn it over to Charlie. Next slide, please. And so before we review those programs, I think it's important to take a moment and kind of walk through our journey to complete streets. And it's helpful to really set the stage by briefly describing how our transportation network was built over the last century and why we face some of the challenges today that we face. So during the first half of the 20th century, streets were built to support a streetcar and accommodate walking. We had connected streets with sidewalks almost everywhere. And this area is typically what we also refer to as Route 4. Some of you are familiar with that. And this is an area that is basically 4 miles beyond the center city in each direction. During the second half of this century, of the 20th century, and this is also where we experienced our most significant growth in what we often call suburban sprawl, we moved into very auto-oriented street design and development. These streets aren't as connected, and they often have access to major residential and business developments through very limited entrances and exits. We have lots of cul-de-sacs. We often don't have sidewalks or sidewalks at back of curb on some very congested streets. And this limited access that we built out during that last 50 years of the last century is really what creates the need for wider thoroughfares in those areas because of that limited access. So by the early 2000s, we started to develop policies to create more complete streets and better access for all users. We began requiring sidewalks on new subdivision streets and introduced our first capital funding program for sidewalk construction 20 years ago in 2002. Since that time, we've made a lot of progress, but again, we still have a lot of work to do. In 2006, Council adopted the Transportation Action Plan, which was our first comprehensive transportation policy. In 2007, we adopted a urban street design guideline, which is our comprehensive guideline for street design. And then fast forward to 2010, we started to work into our code for development of complete streets, many of these policies that were adopted in 2006 and 2007. In 2017, council adopted a Charlotte Walks and a Charlotte Bikes plan to really strengthen our policies around accommodating safe and connected pedestrian and bike facilities. And then in 2019, we adopted our first streets map to support the Blue Line and transit-oriented development. Next slide, please. So now let's talk a little bit about CIP programs and how that policy work that I just talked about really informs that prioritization. So we've done a lot of substantial work in developing transportation mobility policies to build complete streets and advance those goals of building a more connected mobility network for all users. These policies are focused on safety with Vision Zero, prioritizing investment on our most dangerous corridors, which are also often our most congested corridors. These policies are also focused on building a connected network and providing access to the places that people want to travel, especially for pedestrians and cyclists, and supporting transit access. And of course, transit access is really important because we do see this as one of our strongest tools in managing for congestion and growth in the future as our city continues to grow. This policy lays the foundation for prioritizing projects that we pursue through capital funding. Next slide, please. And so now let's focus on sidewalk and pedestrian safety. Next slide, please. This program focuses on improving walkability and an experience that is safe, useful, and inviting for our pedestrians. Projects are prioritized again, focusing on safety, congestion, and connectivity. And so funding in this program is used to construct new sidewalks, fill in existing gaps for sidewalks, and provide for safe pedestrian crossings. We have a goal of 10 miles of sidewalk every year, and so that comes not only from this program funding, but also from other CIP projects or any other project where NCDOT or a developer might be building sidewalk. The Sidewalk and Pedestrian Program was first funded in 2002, and so now we're 20 years beyond that initial investment. And again, we've done a lot of work, but there's still a lot to do, and you'll see that when I highlight the map in a few slides. So the other thing I want to point out is that in 2020, we had bond funding of $15 million, and in 2022, council supported bond funding of $50 million. And so this more than triples the amount of 2020 bond funding of $15 million. Also, in the last year, there was a lot of discussion among council about the suburban areas that don't have sidewalk. And so as part of that 2022 funding recommendation, there was a minimum of 20% of that $50 million that's to be allocated to sidewalks in our suburban areas. So you'll see what that looks like when I share the map with you in a few slides. Next slide, please. All right, and then again, I want to touch on the sidewalk and pedestrian safety criteria. And you've heard me mention these phrases a few times, and again, they're very important. So when I talk about safety, we're looking at our high injury network, and that means that we're looking at those locations where we have a documented crash history. So those are some of our most unsafe conditions in our transportation network. We look at the speed limit on a street, whether or not street lighting exists. And we're looking for things that indicate a level of comfort for that pedestrian, because that's important as well. We look at traffic volumes, because what we also see is that some of our most congested streets for cars are also the places where we have some of our most higher pedestrian activity, which means that those pedestrians have great difficulty in crossing those more congested streets. And that typically aligns with transit ridership as well. And then last but certainly not least is connectivity. That is super important because we want to make sure that we're making connections that support that safe access to the places that people need to go. And that's things like schools, parks, greenways, again, transit access. We also look at land uses and consider the people that might be more likely to be transit-dependent households, and we prioritize access to those land uses as well as the land uses that would provide services to the elderly and the disabled. Next slide, please. And so let's talk a little bit more about sidewalks and the cost of sidewalks, because we've been doing this, as I've mentioned, for the last 20 years. We've constructed quite a bit of sidewalk, and I would say we've been able to complete some of the easier, lower cost, less impact projects. So as with most of our transportation projects, we're continuing to see increases in cost, and we're continuing to see those increases in cost because we're starting to construct some of the more complicated sidewalk projects. And what I mean when I say that is that we're seeing costs in real estate increasing because some of these sidewalks are in more developed areas where real estate is more expensive. On the other hand, we're also seeing sidewalks in some less developed areas, but those are equally as expensive because they tend to be more suburban or rural areas with unimproved street cross sections. So we have to make significant drainage improvements through these sidewalk construction projects. And they also require more right-of-way in those instances. And in addition, utilities are always a challenge, and we're often finding that some of the sidewalk projects that we are pursuing now have fairly significant utility impacts. And then as with any other construction cost increase that we're seeing, the cost of labor and materials is going up as well. And so now we're starting to see current cost estimates range from $4 to $8 million. Now that's a turnkey sidewalk project, so that includes the planning, design, and construction. Next slide, please. And so again, this is the map, and this is one of the maps that was shared in your packets. So again, we'll talk about 3 of those today. So this is one of the 3 that we'll go into a bit more detail about. So this map shows our active sidewalk projects along with the backlog of needs. So projects that are shown in green are at some point in the process of planning, design, or construction and funded through approved bonds. Projects that are shown in yellow indicate those that are prioritized to begin planning and cost estimating with the next round of bond funding. Evaluations are underway for the projects shown in orange, and this means we're doing feasibility work, and depending on the cost estimates for the previous projects shown in yellow, the orange segments will be our next prioritized projects that we'll move forward with depending on funding availability. So this process allows our prioritization ranking to be extremely responsive and reflect existing conditions. So for example, as new developments come online, we're updating this list constantly and reflecting the latest information so that we can prioritize these projects and tackle the most important needs in our community. So last but certainly not least, shown in red, there are 245 miles of sidewalk that are missing on thoroughfares. And let me talk a little bit about that for a minute. This reflects the policy that we have to have sidewalks on both sides of the street for a thoroughfare. So some of these red lines may reflect sidewalk needed on both sides, and some may reflect sidewalk needed on one side, but the 245 is the total number. So I'll also add that, again, this sidewalk program alone doesn't build all of what's shown in red. For example, we just completed a sidewalk project on Barkley Downs that was funded through a CNIP program. And as I mentioned before, sidewalks are also built through our road projects and through any new development, as well as any NCDOT projects.
So, Ms. Babson, before you
Yes, sir.
move on, could I ask a couple of questions about that slide, that last one?
Yes, sir.
Can we bring that back up, the preceding? And those are pedestrian crossings. Yes.
Sidewalk.
The one that has thoroughfares without sidewalk, that title.
So it's 2 back. Yes.
There. So you said that we have 11 miles that will be paid for as a result of bonds that are already authorized,
Yes, sir.
right? And the 5 miles right now is scheduled for the next bond cycle.
Yes, sir.
And in that, we have $50 million total for pedestrian. So can we assume that there's more that will actually get done in that bond cycle than these 5 miles?
Possibly. So let me describe this a little bit differently. So what's shown in green and reflected in the 11 miles is in some stage of planning, design, or construction. So current bond funding doesn't bring all 11 miles to completion.
Okay?
So some of that $50 million will have to go to construct some of the projects that are in the 11 miles.
But then presumably, we don't have to pay the entire cost of the 5 miles with the next bond cycle.
So the next bond cycle, the 22, we will start planning and design for a new 5 miles that will move into that program.
But you don't expect that we'll be able to proceed on more than 5 miles as a result of this $50 million commitment we're making?
We think we can, and so what we're doing is we're working on those 5 miles, and we're starting cost estimating. Once we get costs estimated for those, we'll know how many of the 7 miles we can then move into planning,
Right.
design, and construction.
And is it your assumption that the 7 miles can be funded with the total of what is it, 50, 17, 20, 20, it's 107, I think, million over the 4 bond cycles in our capital plan?
Yes, I'm
course,
confident that we can
that
build
leaves
that
us
7
with,
miles with that money.
With a big gap. You described your prioritization criteria. So as funds become available, do you just go from the top down? Once you've done that prioritization, do you basically just take them, the highest ones on the list? Or how does the final decision get made about which projects get funded?
So we reevaluate every 2 years with new bond funding to make sure that we've got the latest information about existing conditions. So for example, if a new development came online and it would change the way that criteria impacted the ranking, then that project might move up the list. So once we've started evaluation and we've made a commitment, then that project moves forward through the planning, design, and construction.
Right. I think the key takeaway here is the 245 miles. I mean, this reminds me a little bit of where we were with stormwater a couple of years ago and that backlog of service requests. So if anything, to me, the moral of this story is that we have a huge need. And when you look at the amount that we're actually able to do, as evidenced by the other 3 categories, that's 23 miles that we have in different stages,
Yes.
representing less than 10% of the amount.
Yes.
I just
We
want
do.
to underscore that.
Yes, we do have a lot of work to do. I will add, I won't speak for stormwater, but what I can say about the sidewalk map that you're looking at is based on current policies and requirements for development completed by the private sector, as well as any projects completed by the city and/or NCDOT. So public and private investment going forward will build the sidewalks required. And so I say that to say that this is a pretty defined list of sidewalk needs. So this list, unlike the stormwater challenge, doesn't necessarily get bigger as we get new information.
Right, right. And I think we could spend a lot of time talking in more detail about what's in the 245, and we don't want to do that. That's probably a TAP committee meeting anyway. But I think it's safe to infer from that we have a huge need and that our progress towards meeting that need is slow at this point. Thanks.
Thank you.
Ms. Ajmira.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just going to make a point that I think you have made very well, that we are nowhere near addressing the immediate need of our sidewalks. And I know we have seen fatalities increase because of the lack of infrastructure. So this is an issue that I do look forward to discussing in our budget workshop. I don't know what other tools we have to increase or at least expedite the construction of our sidewalks. So, Ms. Babson, could you go back to the slide of our funding commitment?
That's slide 7.
So we are going from 15 to 50?
Yes,
Is that
ma'am.
correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And there is a big increase. So that will only fill 10 miles of sidewalk. And what is the completion timeframe like? Once we have the bond approval, what is the completion timeframe for this 10-mile sidewalk?
So let me just clarify, the 10 miles is a goal that we have, and that 10 miles is made up not only of projects that are funded through the Sidewalk and Pedestrian Safety Program, but also projects that are completed through private development and NCDOT. So we are not able to build 10 miles at the current funding level of 15 million.
No, with 50 million.
So with 50 million, that gets to the map that I was describing. We will begin 5 miles and move those into planning, design, and construction. We will complete some construction on some portion of the 11 miles that are already in the process. And then depending on the most current cost estimates, we will be able to move some portion of the ones shown in orange into planning, design, and construction.
How many miles are we talking about with 50 million? Obviously, there will be private sector that will play a part in that, but I'm just trying to figure out what will 50 million get to?
So
I think that was the explanation we just heard, which is essentially the 50 million allows us to proceed along the schedule that appears on that slide. Is that right, Ms. Babson?
So
yes.
how many miles is that? That's what I'm struggling with.
Well, it's,
So we will complete the 11, we can do 5, but again, the 11 were funded from previous bonds, because this is a program that is continuously funding planning, design, and construction. So it is a little difficult to separate out exactly what is completed with the $50 million, because it's an ongoing funded program.
So we'll complete
So
11, additional 5.
We'll complete the 11, we'll add 5, and then once we get cost estimates on the 5, we will begin to move some number of those 7 miles into planning and design.
and Ms. Ajmira, if you consider the information above where a mile of sidewalk costs $48 million, $50 million
saw.
would be expected to buy you something like 9 miles. So there isn't a huge bonanza there.
Yes, and because of the rising real estate costs that Ms. Babson mentioned earlier, I understand that this $50 million investment is just the drop in the ocean, similar to what we are doing with affordable housing and stormwater. It's just the drop in the ocean. So, but the good thing is that our private partners will help us with some of these sidewalks as we get additional developments. And that's a good thing. So the problem doesn't get bigger, it only gets smaller over the course of time. So that's a great thing. If you go back to that slide where you have this red and yellow, how many miles
Slide
are we
10.
talking about? How many miles are we talking about where we'll, okay, 245 miles. Okay, I'm good. Thank you.
And I think it's important to note here, we obviously need to have conversations probably in the Transportation and Planning Committee about policy. So the role of this committee is simply to identify the budget implications of this issue, and appreciate your briefing on this. And then maybe send a message back to our colleagues, we are behind and we're falling further behind. I mean, if you really have all of the likely needs included, maybe we're not falling further behind that from what you said. That number doesn't get bigger, but there are new roads that we need to build, and
But as we build
they're
those
not
roads,
in
they'll
there,
have
right?
sidewalk. Bryant Farms Road is a great example.
Yeah,
That new,
yeah.
that new road will have sidewalk.
So you can say that we're way behind and we're not catching up, and certainly not at a rate that will get the sidewalks built out the way we'd like in less than 100 years. Okay, so that's the moral of that story. And I think you wanted to talk about pedestrian crossings? Is there another question? What, Mr. Phipps? Yes, please, sir.
Oh, yeah. in view of the budget considerations and how the current funding is not going to be enough, I've mentioned this before, but I think we should seriously consider and look at other components of materials that we use to construct sidewalks. Now, I'm over here in the University City area, and I know around these different student housing complexes that we have here leading to the campus of UNC Charlotte, they've constructed asphalt walking paths or sidewalks. I mean, to me, I don't understand why we would not consider some of these types of asphalt walking paths in some of our areas to help with the, even the backlog. I mean, those things get used they're used pretty regularly. So I don't know if we're still concerned about the longevity of a concrete sidewalk compared to an asphalt structure. But I think in view of how much it costs and the backlog that we're seeing and that hole that we seem to be, that doesn't seem to be getting filled, that we should be entertaining some kind of way to look at other materials to help us through this potentially. Any comments about that at all?
Yes, sir. Great point. And I will tell you, we are constantly, as an organization, looking at best practices across the country. Probably within the last 12 to 24 months, we did an evaluation of exactly what you just described. We looked at the cost benefit and the long-term maintenance of asphalt compared to concrete. And when you look at it across the life of the concrete, the savings is negligible, if at all. And so the challenge would be the materials cost really doesn't give you any benefit using a lesser expensive product initially, and you have to meet the same design requirements and construction to place that asphalt as you would with the concrete.
Mr. Phipps, I thought you were going to suggest that we use coal ash.
Hey, seems like it's no easy answers out of this dilemma that we have here. But it seems like that path, and I dedicated one of them several years ago, it's still going strong. So, but I'm surprised to learn that it would only be negligible that, so in other words, we might as well be going for the Cadillac version, huh?
I think that the issue you raise is a good issue. It sounds like it has been investigated, and I'm happy to be guided by the advice that we get from staff. All done, Mr. Phipps?
That's it, yes.
All right, so shall we do the pedestrian crossing?
Yes, sir. Slide 11 is where we left off. Great. So pedestrian crossings is another component that is funded through that sidewalk and pedestrian safety program. And I just want to touch on this real quickly because this is an extremely important transportation improvement that we've been undertaking for the last several years. So these improvements are typically what we call a rectangular rapid flashing beacon or a pedestrian hybrid beacon. They range in cost from about $50,000 to about $300,000. The lesser expensive being the rectangular rapid flashing beacon. The more expensive version tends to be the pedestrian hybrid beacon. So just like sidewalk prioritization, these crossings are ranked by considering safety, congestion, and connectivity. Again, these are fairly new treatments. We've been installing these for about the last 5 years and have more than 60 of these across the city in operation today. Next slide, please. And this is just a map that shows you the upcoming projects. So again, planning, design, and construction. So anything that's shown as funded is currently in planning, design, or construction. And that also means that is being planned, designed, and constructed with current approved bonds. So we have 35 of those the future bond, we will pursue 15 crossings, and then there are 47 others that have been identified. Now, unlike sidewalks, this list can grow because as we develop and grow as a city, we're going to have more needs for these types of crossings across the city.
So that's a roughly $10 million prospect?
For the 47,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah, okay.
All right, moving on.
Bless you.
Next slide, please. Moving on to Vision Zero. So again, I'll talk a bit about Vision Zero, and then we'll dive into some street lighting information, because I understand that's where you had some questions and discussion at your last meeting. So next slide, please. So again, I want to reiterate, while Vision Zero is a standalone program and has its own funding, safety is embedded in everything that we do, and we are constantly looking to improve the safety for all of our users on our street. So while this is a separate program, safety is definitely top of mind in the work that we do every day. So this program allows us to do things that aren't otherwise done through other programs, like street lighting, neighborhood traffic calming, spot safety projects, and then some technology improvements. Next slide, please. All right, so a bit about our street lighting program. We know street lighting is important to council and the community, and over the years, we've had a number of conversations with you about street lighting and how we can improve our street lighting on our city streets and state streets, because we're responsible for those as well. The state only provides street lighting on the interstates. So until the creation of this Vision Zero capital program in 2018, we really didn't have a way to add street lights to our system but for a standalone road project. So we're really excited about this Vision Zero funding and our ability now to light some of our streets across the city. We currently have over 77,000 street lights citywide. And some years ago, there was some concern from council and the community about the number of outages that we had. So since that time, I'm happy to report we have less than 5% outages on our street lighting system. And that's because we've really made a concerted effort within the department to commit to going out and conducting an annual inventory. We actually inventory about 40 to 50% of that system every year now, which is something that we just started in the last 3 to 4 years. Prior to that, we only received outage information as residents would call in and report that streetlights were out. And at that time, we were averaging more than 20% outages. And that's important as well, because the way the street lighting system operates is Duke owns and operates the street lights. We pay for the ability to have those street lights and the electricity, and we pay that fee whether they're operating or not. So a high outage rate is certainly not good. Couple of other things I want to point out. We're working closely with Duke to upgrade our street lights to LEDs. We now have 25% of that system that's already LED, and we're working closely with Duke to prioritize the corridors that they will continue to upgrade throughout the coming years with LED street lights. And council, we've heard from you as well about the interest in having smart street lights. And the biggest benefit with that is that it tells us proactively when a street light is out. So we partnered with Duke on a pilot to install 200 smart street lights in the North End Smart District. And so we'll continue to evaluate that pilot and look forward to creating an implementation strategy with Duke in the coming years. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about cost for street lights. There's a number of factors that impact the cost for street lighting. It's the type of pole that might be required, as well as any existing utility impacts, whether or not we have direct access to power or we have to build that. And then if there is any need to install new poles or move poles, then obviously we've got some real estate costs that we have to consider as well. So again, the street classification actually determines the type of pole, and so for higher speed, higher volume streets, it requires more expensive poles that are metal and designed to break away so as not to create a hazard in the street. And those breakaway poles cost up to $300,000 and cost per mile. And if we don't have to do the breakaway poles, then we can do wood poles at a slightly lower cost at about $200,000 per mile. And then it's important to also note that in addition to that upfront capital cost to install the street lighting, we also have an ongoing annual operating expense of about $20,000 per mile that we add to our system. Next slide,
So,
please.
Ms. Babson, on that one, you said that Duke owns the pole. So is that cost per pole a cost to us?
Yes.
And how is it that they then own the poles? We pay for them.
Yes. We enter into an agreement with Duke, and we pay a tariff rate that is a function of the capital cost and then the ongoing maintenance of that pole.
Right, but the actual capital outlay is theirs, is that right? And then we pay them through an agreement, or trying to understand what Duke's role is in this?
So Duke owns and operates the street lighting poles.
But we pay for them.
Street lights, we pay for them.
Good deal, okay. All right, thanks.
There are benefits and there are disadvantages.
Yeah.
All right, next slide, please. And so here's another map that's included in the packet that you received. We'll talk a bit about this. This map shows the thoroughfares without streetlights. And we currently have 19 miles committed, that's shown in green, and that is with existing funding. We have 15 miles prioritized based on the upcoming bond money. And then last but certainly not least, shown in red are other thoroughfares that do not have street lighting and no funding available at this time. I will point out that part of the reason that the number is so high on the prioritized future bond is because we just received approval on February 16th that we are receiving $1 million in bonus allocation funds to build the street lighting system on W.T. Harris Boulevard from Mount Holly Huntersville Road to I-85, and that's an 8-mile segment. And so that is grant funding.
So from this, it looks like the current cost of the 141 miles would be something like 35 million? Would that be a good guess?
I can't do that math that fast, but I trust you.
I'm just taking 250 apiece across 141 miles. Okay.
All right, next slide, please. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Charlie Jones and let him share with you a bit about our street resurfacing program.
Good afternoon, everyone. I go through a crash
Driggs,
course.
I have questions on street lighting.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. So here again, here is another challenge that the solution that we have in front of us is just a drop in the ocean for the need that we have. So if you go back to the funding slide again, is there a possibility to increase the 2022 bond from 4 million to a higher amount?
Let me take that one, Ms. Ajmira. This is Ryan. So at the workshop next week, we're going to talk about a couple of different things. And one thing Teresa will preview today is that our steady state capacity will go up some. And then on top of that, we'll learn at the workshop from our city engineer and others that some of our road projects are actually a little bit cheaper than we had anticipated. So there will be a little bit of capacity to talk about how council would like to match it up to the bonds. And so the final presentation of the workshop next week will be about that. Here's what we think the capacity above our current plan is, and give you guys an opportunity to try to identify changes or needs that you feel would be in our best interest.
That is very helpful. Thank you, Ryan. So yeah, I would like to see this amount go up. I have talked to Ms. Babson a couple of times and her team. They've done an excellent job creating this presentation slides of where the gaps are, where the high priority gaps are, and where the needs are overall, and how we are contributing towards that every year. And I've given an example where we have W.T. Harris Road all the way from Old Concord to Plaza. There are no streetlights, and this is a major thoroughfare, and people walk. I mean, this is very close to even our blue line, and we don't have sidewalks for people to get to, people to ride our public transit. So this is a serious issue. This is not just an issue about our, this is not just our infrastructure issue. This is really a safety issue. I've seen people walk in the dark once they take our public transit system. It is very dangerous, and we need to address this. And I remember when we had last talked, Ms. Babson, this W.T. Harris corridor, of the segment that I'm talking about from Old Concord to Plaza, was in top 3 list. So even with this $4 million of funding, it will barely get there. So what I would like to see, it's great that we have this funds. We are going from $2 to $4 million. I would like to see how many projects are we going to be able to tackle with this funding. So we have a list here. I have it in front of me, where there are top 4 items. How many of this that we will be able to tackle with this increased funding?
So I think, as I suggested before, there's kind of a crossover to a TAP conversation here. And I think, Ms. Majmira, from what you're saying, the question we might ask is, how much weight does the prioritization process assign to these high-risk, very dangerous areas? I know safety is a criterion, and so do we need to look at whether we're moving quickly enough on the most dangerous places? But I think that's probably a TAP conversation. Again, what I want to bring out here is the magnitude of the pipeline in these different areas compared to the rate at which we're investing. And in a minute, we'll talk about the opportunity we may have to invest more, right? So, Ms. Babson, if you would, unless there's anything else.
Yeah, so Mr. Driggs, yes, this is a TAP conversation in terms of the priority, but at the end of the day, it comes down to the budget to tackle this underlying issue. TAP committee can set the policy, but if you don't have funding, which is in this case pretty clear, whether it's sidewalks, whether it's streetlights, or whether it's stoplights, I mean, it comes down to the funding, and we got to figure out a solution from the funding perspective. And $4 million isn't going to do this.
I agree. I mean, as I say, I think what we're doing here is highlighting the relationship between the needs we have and the amount of money that we're committing. And that's a top priority. We need to share that message with our colleagues. But then at some point, if there's a question about whether we're doing the right things immediately, that might be a policy conversation that's not in budget. So I don't think we're disagreeing, Ms. Ajmira. We need to look hard at how much money we have and how much we need in order to maintain minimum standards of safety, because it really is not just a convenience thing, it's a safety thing. The lighting, the sidewalks, all of this. And I think I had an issue in my district where school kids were walking along Kuykendall and standing right at the edge of the road where the cars were whizzing by waiting for their bus. And we're able to provide some relief there, but there are situations like that everywhere. So agree with that. Do you have anything else, Ms. Ajmira?
That's all I have. I look forward to having that conversation with our colleagues at our budget workshop, and hopefully see this funding level go up. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And let's move on to resurfacing then. Charlie. What, Mr. Phipps?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I wonder at some point if we have to be realistic and come to the realization that I don't know that we will be able to fund all of these projects in our lifetime or maybe in somebody else's lifetime. I mean, I think we should identify what we truly need and differentiate it from what we want. Because I mean, I just don't see us trying to, I mean, just buying our way out of all of these needs in terms of, I mean, street lights, you know, and such. I mean, as development occurs, you get more density, you get more people walking. But even some of these suburban areas, I mean, I've been, my area was annexed in 2003. And so we still, you know, incrementally, we're getting street lights and sidewalks and things, but it's going to take time. And I don't think, you know, to fund this to the level we think it needs. I mean, we're talking about, I mean, we might even be talking about tax increases or whatever. And I don't know what the appetite is for something like that. But I just don't see, I think we're going to have to come to the realization that these buckets of money we get, it's never going to be enough. And we're just going to have to prioritize our needs more efficiently.
You got to be careful saying those two words. You're going to start a riot. Okay, let's do Mr. Jones. Yeah.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Talk a little bit about resurfacing, offer kind of a crash course in street preservation. When we talk about resurfacing for the City of Charlotte, there are two main goals for this program. The first is to extend the life of the pavement assets of the city, and the second is to reduce the costs associated with maintaining this asset. Just how big is our street system? City of Charlotte currently maintains 5,479 lane miles of streets. Put that in a little perspective, you can drive from Charlotte to San Francisco and back in 5,424 miles. So we have a very large street system.
And that's not including the state roads, is that right?
That is not including the state roads.
Because we have actually quite more state roads in a lot of places here.
Yes,
Yeah,
correct.
thanks.
There's one primary measure we use to quantify the overall health of our road network. That measures the pavement condition rating, otherwise known as the PCR. Next slide. The PCR measurement represents the condition of our road network at a given point in time. The ranges represented in the chart to the right are an industry standard breakdown of PCR ranges from very good to very poor, and include the percentage of Charlotte streets rated in each category. Streets are rated on a scale of 0 to 100, with 100 being a newly resurfaced street, and a 0 rated street which shows significant distresses and failures. Trained pavement raters or artificial intelligence-based systems evaluate the pavement surface and deduct points from that 100 for distresses such as potholes, cracking, ruts, utility cuts, and rough pavements. Based on our last survey conducted in 2019, 62% of Charlotte streets were rated good or very good. One of the key factors that affects the pavement condition rating is the age of the pavement surface. I'll take just a quick moment to talk about road construction now. Roads are built in layers, similar to a layer cake. What we're talking about with resurfacing is really that top surface. The top layer not only gives you a smooth surface to drive on, but it also protects the structural layers beneath. The resurfacing process replaces this top layer as it ages to restore the smooth ride, but just as important, it protects the structural elements of the road. As the surface layer cracks and becomes brittle with age, moisture and physical strains will penetrate to the lower road layers and require more repairs than just resurfacing. The surface layer of asphalt has a useful life of about 18 to 20 years. Next slide. These are some images of actual city streets to show the progression of pavement conditions over time. Starting on the left, you can see a freshly paved street. This street will remain in that condition for several years. Most streets in Charlotte's network fall into the good category, as seen in the second image. You may notice some cracking, but all in all, the surface is relatively smooth, and the cracks are not covering significant areas of the road. This road surface in that image is approximately 5 to 10 years old. The third image is a road surface between 10 to 15 years old. You can see a considerable amount of cracking and a significant patch in the middle of the road. There's a good chance that portions of this street will need additional repairs when it's time for resurfacing. The final image is a street that has not been paved in more than 25 years. Potholes are evident, and the amount of cracking and loose stone indicates that the base of the road has been compromised. The deterioration process shown in these photos assumes that only normal traffic and the environment are affecting the road surface. In reality, utility cuts, overweight vehicles, leaking pipes, and other factors can accelerate that deterioration process. This chart from the Federal Highway Administration illustrates the timing of maintenance activities and the steep deterioration in the pavement quality once a poor condition is experienced or pavements begin to reach the end of their useful life. Road surface quality drops approximately 40% after 15 to 18 years. While the overall ride quality and appearance of the road is what most of us associate with a need for resurfacing, this decline in quality also comes with a higher price tag when it is time to resurface. The longer cracks and distresses are allowed to persist on the road surface, the higher the likelihood that the subsurface layers are damaged and will also need repair. Costs for preservation, including resurfacing, are 6 to 10 times less than reconstruction later in the pavement's useful life. So to avoid increases in maintenance costs, the best practice is to treat or replace the surface layer in as timely a manner as possible. CDOT's worked over the years to evaluate and select additional treatment options to extend pavement life beyond resurfacing. We are currently applying materials within the first 2 to 4 years after resurfacing that we've shown to successfully reduce cracking over the life of the pavement. We also have other treatment options that are applied later in a pavement's life, but they tend to not be well received by residents. Next slide. So where do we currently stand? Following all that background information. Based on the last pavement evaluation conducted in 2019, Charlotte's current pavement condition rating is 82 out of 100, which is toward the lower end of the good category. Charlotte's resurfacing cycle is currently 35 years. In layman's term, if a street's resurfaced this year in 2022, it will not be resurfaced again until 2057. CDOT has been strategic with the allocation of contract funding during the pandemic, which has allowed us to minimize the impact to the resurfacing cycle and pavement condition rating. However, years of reductions in state funding will cause the resurfacing cycle to increase significantly in 2023. Funding for street maintenance activities prior to FY20 was approximately $25 million annually. Strategic recommendations by the manager's office, approved by council and voted on by residents during the 2020 bond referendum, shifted a portion of resurfacing funding from the general fund to GO and PAYGO bonds and resulted in an increase of $1 million annually. Unfortunately, pandemic shortfalls reduced POW bill distributions from the state in 2021, and the state budget passed in late 2021 kept the $6.8 million reductions for Charlotte effective for the FY22 and 23 budget years. Next slide. So with that, kind of sum up the challenges faced with the resurfacing program. Our network continues to grow. Average annual growth of Charlotte's street network is 30+ lane miles per year. That's new street construction by the city and developers, as well as the acceptance of private streets located within the city limits. Like Ms. Babson said earlier, construction costs continue to rise. We have not experienced drastic increases in resurfacing costs, but we have experienced those since 2016. The average annual increase has been around 12% in resurfacing costs. It's mainly driven by oil prices, labor rates, and just general inflation. And then finally, the third challenge is funding for resurfacing. It's not kept pace with the growth of our system and cost increases. Since 2016, funding from the state of North Carolina has not increased despite the increased mileage and resurfacing cost in our system. So that's all I have, if there's any questions.
That's a lot.
Yes.
So I think the key here is the comparison between the resurfacing cycle at 35+ years at our funding level and the preceding slide that shows that pavements between 15 and 20 years old experience a significant decrease. So that means that we would expect a deterioration of our road network and basically get into a deeper and deeper hole if we don't arrive at a better steady state program for repaving,
Correct.
right? And this is really a stitch in time saves nine type of situation. The worse you let it get, the more fundamental the repair is, as opposed to just putting another layer on top. I assume if the road is sort of broken up, the banging of wheels and stuff like that contributes also to deterioration, because you're going over those bumps which create ripples on highways and things.
It doesn't help, but the biggest driver is the moisture.
Right,
That
yeah, sure.
Moisture finds a way.
Yeah.
And it gets in all the cracks.
So, do we have any questions? No?
Yeah, I'll ask one.
Mr. Phipps, go ahead.
Yeah, so, okay, say if you're in a subdivision and you look at the road and it looks like it's in deteriorating condition. So can a resident call up and request a street resurfacing? Or will you all look at, okay, they might do that, but you will look at the last time it was resurfacing, and if it's within that 35-year window, it's just tough luck?
Not quite tough luck, Councilmember Phipps. But we encourage residents to call 311 if they do feel their street needs resurfacing. And our normal process is we send a supervisor for that area out to evaluate the street. They know the streets in their district. And what we're looking at is, can that street last a few more years so that we can work it into a paving schedule? Or are the distresses we see out there something that's going to tip that street over the edge to get down to where it's going to cost us a small fortune, and we'll be working in that neighborhood for a long time to make the repairs. So it's a delicate balance of meeting the customer's needs and desires versus managing a tight budget, so to speak, for resurfacing.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Ajmira.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this is a question to see if there are other funding opportunities outside of our city, grant opportunities, or even through infrastructure bill. Would there be any opportunities for us to consider tapping into for our sidewalks, street lights, pavement, and other infrastructure needs?
Do you want to take that one, or you want me to? Yes, ma'am, I'll take that question. So we are absolutely watching closely the new infrastructure bill. Some of those programs are new, and so they'll have to go to the respective federal agencies to develop criteria and stand those programs up. So we'll see more information in the coming year about those details. I'll give you an example. RAISE grant is one that's not new, and so the city is working to develop the most competitive grant submission for the RAISE grant, and we'll continue to work to bring forward the best, most competitive projects for those grants as we learn more information about the details and the requirements.
Great, thank you.
Mr. Jones, what would it take to get that resurfacing cycle down to 15 years? Do we have to fully replace the 6.8? Would it take more than that? Do you have an idea of what we're talking about?
Down to 15, I think, Ryan, let's see if I've got my numbers handy.
Or any benchmark, 15 or 20, but is there can we point to something that says, if you had this much more money, your resurfacing cycle would be X years? Because that's very interesting information.
I believe we were looking at forgive me if I'm wrong. I don't have that number off
I
the
don't
top of my
either.
head. I'm trying to remember.
So, I mean, I think that's one of the advantages of
We can come
doing
up.
this presentation here and at the workshop. We'll certainly have that ready at the workshop. I think one important message is that restoring the amount equivalent to that Powell bill funding, that does not represent an enhancement to the program. It just brings us back to where we were, which was already starting to get a little bit behind just because of the growth of the streets and the cost of resurfacing. So, I mean, without going too far, I think it's fair to say that from a staff perspective, figuring out a way to get us back to where we were at a minimum is extremely important.
Right, I just think this metric, so the council has a kind of a performance metric we can look at is really interesting. So whether we choose 20 as our reference, I mean, if I had to guess, I would assume that restoring the Powell funds gets us in the 20 to 25 range, based on no science whatsoever. But it would actually take more to get to the sweet spot on this curve and to achieve the greatest efficiencies in resurfacing.
Correct. And one of the challenges, Ryan alluded to this, one of the challenges is if we do receive a level of funding to get us to where the funds were lost from Powell bill, we might hit a 25-year cycle, but that would only be for 1 year. So without a steady state funding,
Right.
The cycle will drop every year subsequent from that. It's an element we've struggled with over the years, is the growth.
So, Mr. Jones, thank you. Appreciate what you do. Really, it's important. To conclude this, I just would like to say to staff, if we as Budget Committee can try to take this data and take a couple of the things I highlighted in this meeting just to communicate to the whole council, here is the funding that we have, here are the needs that we've identified, and our goal should be, as Budget Committee, to evolve a plan that says, being realistic about the resources that we can hope to get, what can we expect? And we did something like this with stormwater. We had those curves that showed the trajectory of the priority. So however we want to define it, we have to, for policy purposes on the budget, we have to kind of make a connection between levels of funding and outcomes. And that is pretty critical for our conversation. And that's why I said, how much does it take to get us down to 25 years or 20 years? And that's $1 billion worth of these road projects implied by the data we got about that. It's about 10 million for crossfield walks, and it's about 35 million for streetlights. So, we can assign sort of numbers in terms of the shortfall that we have, and then that would give us something to look at as we consider the next item on our agenda. And are you doing that, Mr. Bergman, or? You're going to do that. All right. CFO.
Yes, again, my name is Teresa Smith. I am the CFO, and I have with me today Matt Hasted, so he is available for any questions, but wanted to give you an update on what we call the steady state affordability. If you'll go to the next slide. So we're going to talk about what is steady state. We've been using that terminology already, but when we talk about it here, this is specific to debt affordability. We'll dive a little deeper into the debt model and what some of the assumptions are to give you an idea of how the steady state affordability is calculated. Then we'll talk about what that updated steady state amount is, and then we'll wrap it up with why all of this matters. So next slide. So as I was thinking about this presentation, I thought about this in the context that the capital program really is the production. It's what people see. It's the projects that get completed. It's the allocation of resources. What we are doing today with the steady state is we are setting the stage for that production. So we are setting the backdrop so that we know the money that is available as the council moves forward with allocating projects. So next slide. So what is the steady state? When we talk about it in this context, we're really talking about debt affordability. We know that we have a comprehensive capital program. We've also talked about this a little bit today, that it's not just things that we can fund with debt, but there are other ways that we fund our projects, whether that's with PAYGO or grant opportunities, potentially cash funding for projects. But debt is one component that we look at to fund this comprehensive program. And generally, we use two types of debt. One of those is the general obligation bonds. These are the bonds that are approved by the voters. So when we talk about housing bonds, transportation bonds, or neighborhood bonds, these are the ones that we ask voters to approve. They are also supported by our property taxes. I don't have it on the slide, but this is where we also use our bond anticipation notes. So the bond anticipation note is the short-term version of what we use to get us to the long-term version of the general obligation bonds. The other type of financing that we use is our certificates of participation, or COPs. And this is what we use to fund facilities. This is where we pledge the asset rather than pledging property tax. And when we're looking at affordability, I'll say this is where we are making sure that we are meeting all of our financial policies, particularly the policy that we maintain our fund balance at 50% of the next year's debt service.
So, Ms. Smith, if I could just interrupt quickly. Mr. Bergman, are we planning to use these slides in this presentation at the retreat?
Yeah, we'll use this at the workshop. We can pare it down if you feel that that's in the best interest of the full council, or we can add additional content.
I was just going to say to my colleagues, essentially the steady state is an analysis that tells us what level of debt incurrence our projected revenues and expenses allow. In a way, for this meeting, the critical thing is your conclusion about where the new steady state level is, because then we would need to have the conversation about what the allocation might be or how that relates to what we heard about before. So I'm sorry we got late, and the council should hear what you're telling us. But at the moment, if we look at your slide 10, I think it is, and again, colleagues, if you'll just indulge me here, I want to try and wrap up by 4 and not end up with no time to talk about the takeaway from this steady state analysis, which is that we're looking at, on slide 10, if we got that, yeah, we've been talking about 198 million, which is a number we should all be familiar with right now as the established capacity for debt incurrence, the amount of money that we have available in each bond cycle for capital spending. And there's 50 million on top of the 198, which is the COPs. Those are those special bonds that don't require voter approval and are backed by an asset. So now what we're seeing here, I think, is an estimated increase in that number by 37 million based on our updated analysis. And the key question is, what priorities might we try to address with those extra funds? And we've heard about a couple that are pretty critical, but as we widen the conversation, I think there will be others that our colleagues are going to want to talk about. And that's why I'm hoping that this committee can come up with a framework for justifying certain increases in the sidewalks, the crossings, and the resurfacing programs. Because we're going to have to compete for this money with things that other people would like to do in housing and public safety and so on. So,
if I could add
Yes.
one caveat to that, of the 37 million, there will be a portion, and it will be a minority of it, but there will be a portion that is probably needed for COPs and city facilities and things like that. But the majority should be available for bond funding, like was talked about earlier.
so when you say needed for COPs, I mean, we're including the COPs capacity in this, right? So we had 50 million of assumed COPs capacity, and now we've got 37 million of combined GO and COPs additional capacity. Is that right?
Yes.
So some of that will be COPs, and so that's not too limiting because we probably can address our priorities using COPs and not be too constrained by that.
Right.
But it's a sublimit, effectively. So I just, colleagues, I sort of throw out to you this issue for us about how we advance the idea that we now have new capacity and whether we in budget can make a recommendation about how to prioritize that. Interested to know if you have any thoughts. Apparently not. This is a first. I guess then we'll just take this to the full council, but the moral of the story is that as we go back to our capital plan on page 2, in essence, we can now kind of populate those lines or add lines and reach a higher total. And is that effective with the next bond cycle?
Yeah, so when we go, let me talk a little bit about the workshop. We'll talk about the steady state a little bit with the new capacity. I assume that there'll be a lot of discussion around some of our transportation needs we've been hearing about. As far as the advanced planning road projects, there's a few different scenarios around the roads, but they do all result in some kind of net savings to what we had been carrying in our bond plan of between $20 to $35 million. All of that savings is actually in the 24 through 28 bonds, so it's not immediate capacity. But as for the 22 bond, the capacity that Teresa just talked about is real and it's new. I think for council to prioritize enhancements, we would, of course, point to street resurfacing as one area that could need some refill before we enhance things. But otherwise, that would be the impression, is that other than the roads and the transportation, that the majority of the workshop would be council discussion at the end around priorities, not necessarily just with new capacity, but if there's any suggestions, if there appears to be a consensus on changes with our plan to start with. From that, the manager would make a recommendation. That would be then up to you guys.
Okay. Well, if we have no question from my comments, from my colleagues, which I, wanted to make sure we had time for, if you don't mind, can we go back to where you were and just go ahead and tell us the rest of what you were going to say?
So, steady state, just as a reminder, this was first introduced.
We can't hear.
Yeah, it looks like maybe Ms.
Ms.
Ajmera has been
Ajmera,
trying to
say
speak.
something again.
Ms. Ajmera, are you trying to speak?
Yes, I don't think you're able to hear me.
Okay.
Mr. Phipps
Now
was
we
able to
can.
hear me.
I thought there was something wrong with nobody saying anything. Please go ahead.
Well, obviously, you're gonna have a lot of feedback when you have $37 million additional capacity. So there are a couple of things that come to mind that we do need to consider with our additional capacity. I know Mayor Pro Tem has advocated for additional funding for our CATs, our buses, specifically our app. And she sent an email, I think earlier today, how we don't have a reliable, on-time technology solution. So that's one thing. And second, when it comes to capital priority, our bus system and having that reliable transportation system is a serious issue that we do need to address. And third, I talked about the street lighting and sidewalks that we do need to seriously consider. So yeah, there's a lot that we can tackle with that additional capacity. So I would like to hear some recommendations from staff on those 4 items that I just mentioned. Thanks.
Could you repeat the 4 items, please? What were they?
Yes. So number 1 is our technology solution for CATs. I believe it's called,
This was the app, right?
I don't know what the app is called, but we currently don't have that app that it's working. So that was taken out of the service. So we do need to seriously consider that. Mayor Pro Tem had sent us an email earlier today. I don't know if you all had an opportunity to take a look at that, but there is a serious issue that we do need to address. And second, addressing the reliability of our public buses. So that's second. Third item is our street lights, increasing the capital allocation towards our street lighting projects, specifically around our public transit. For an example, light rail, I gave an example of W.T. Harris stretch from Old Concord to Plaza, very close to light rail. And fourth is our sidewalks.
Got that. Excellent. Staff, my intention would be to report to the full council that the presentation we heard indicates this mismatch between the needs and our current funding situation, and kind of throw open the question of whether we need a referral or what we plan to do about that. But I think we're a little short-sighted at the moment. It would be good, again, if we have reasonable sort of metrics like quantifying. I like this 35-plus years because that's the kind of thing everybody can immediately relate to, and I think it actually captures a whole bunch of different dimensions when you get down to it neatly, right, for the purposes of our conversation. And so we now have the 4 items that Ms. Ajmera highlighted, and I know Mayor Pro Tem will be on board with wanting to invest. The thing about buses, Dimple, is there are some issues there, like their staffing that we heard about. And I also read a report, a WFAE report, that talked about the fact that these buses on a couple of the new routes are driving around empty. So I think there are a number of different ways that we need to tackle that. But certainly an investment in that technology, so we at least have an app, that lets people know when the bus is going to be there. And then, obviously, if the app is telling them that no bus is going to be there, that's not good. So we also need to make sure that there is a bus. But that whole bus conversation is critical. And to me, particularly because that's the thing that we can do near term while we're working on the 20-year horizon for mobility and rail lines and stuff. We should be able to make visible changes to our bus service in a reasonable time frame and for less than $1 billion. So absolutely agree with that. I don't think we need to vote on anything here. Colleagues, if you're okay with me kind of just trying to tell that story when I report out to the full council, I think that's probably a good outcome for this meeting today. Hearing no objection.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, like you said, it could be other needs. I don't know. From as far as community safety is concerned, if there's anything out there that might be of consideration, but to the extent that we could get all of these things on the table, would be good. But I don't think this app, from my reading, that it would take much.
I expect that we will hear, from other committees or people with other priorities. I'm thinking especially of housing. There seems to be kind of a limitless appetite. Things like land banking, are we looking ahead far enough in terms of trying to make sure that our rail lines, the light rail, doesn't result in widespread gentrification? So there are a bunch of things we can talk about, but we should probably start this conversation and be more intentional about how we prioritize the additional money that we now see we have. And does anybody have anything else? Mr. Phipps, Ms. Ajmera?
Yeah. I was wondering, do we have any metrics to show how much of a contribution to our infrastructure when it comes to sidewalks that have been made, been a part of the development that's going on through projects and such? And how much has put a dent in what we are trying to do from a city perspective? Do we have any metrics or anything on that?
So CDOT isn't here. I think we need to put that question to Ms. Babson. But yeah, she alluded to the fact that we expect some of that to be done privately so that we don't have to take responsibility for the entire 245 miles.
Right.
I think it's safe to say that the responsibility we do have is substantial. Good point.
Definitely.
Yeah. Ms. Ajmera, anything else?
No, we covered it all. I think we addressed all the issues. So sidewalks, street lights, cats,
Yes,
everything we can. Yeah.
That was quite a tour. Mr. Cagle, anything else?
Yes, sir.
Do I have a motion to adjourn? All in
So
Do
favor?
we have to?
What's that?
Second, I said, do we have to?
All in favor, hang up.
All right.
Good meeting, all right.